Let us be in prayer. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are indeed our rock, our Savior, and our Redeemer. Amen. When my wife Jody was pregnant with our first child, we put a lot of time into deciding where it was that she would deliver. We lived in Hawaii at the time. I was serving a church on the island of Oahu. There were two primary hospitals we had to choose from: Queen's Hospital and Kapiolani Women's and Children's Hospital. So we went and got tours of each of the facilities, including the birthing rooms, the recovery rooms, the mother and child suites that each of the hospitals had. I even remember taking into consideration the post-delivery celebration dinner that each hospital offered for the young families. Queens had steak and lobster. We chose Queens, by the way. Ezra was about 2 weeks late. Jody's original due date was October 18th, 1994, and on November 2nd, the day before her scheduled induction, Jody and her mom, Joanne, decided to power walk a local mall for about 5 hours, and sure enough, that got her contractions off and running. So they came back to the apartment. Jody took a shower, put her hair up. We grabbed the baby bag that we had ready, and off we were to the hospital. One of the things that Jody did when we first checked her in at Queens was to ask for an epidural. So if you are a guy out there who has no idea what an epidural is, basically it's a very powerful pain medication delivered in the small of a woman's back, very close to the spine. It's a very delicate procedure. Kind of think of it as the equivalent of sea salt, caramel, dark chocolates for delivering moms. Yeah. Well, anyway, after she got the epidural, and as the evening went on, we began to notice, or the doctors did, a disturbing trend. Every time Jody had a contraction, our baby's heart rate dropped. They even screwed a tiny little monitor onto the top of his head in utero for more accurate recordings. And they said the worst case scenario is that the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, and the staff worried that further contractions might actually strangle him. So the plan was to give Jody medicine to stop the contractions, which would also allow the baby's heart to rest. Well, when the contractions stopped, the heart rate stayed strong, which gave Jody's OBGYN encouragement. Turns out the umbilical cord was just pinched. It wasn't wrapped around Ezra's head. We just didn't know it at the time. So instead of ordering a C-section, which many doctors would have done at that point, Jody's doctor decided to give her medicine to start the contractions going again. Now, it was a very slow process. So slow that they had to top off her epidural 2 more times before all was said and done. Her doctor told her to push when she felt the contractions, but she actually had so much pain meds in her that she couldn't feel the contractions at all. I guess you would say she got an entire box of sea salt dark chocolates. A nurse had to tell Jody when to push when she was having a contraction, and so she pushed 3 times. That was it. 1, 2, 3, and Ezra was out. In fact, the doctor used a suction cup to get him out quickly, which made him look like he had a beanie on when he came into the world, not to be confused with the actual beanie that you see in the picture here. But we were so grateful for all of the expertise and the medical sophistication at our disposal, and I truly believe Queens was, for us, definitely the right choice. So welcome to the 3rd week in Advent, our series entitled This Unexpected Christmas. And as I was thinking back over this past year and all of the challenges that the pandemic has imposed upon us, I realized there's quite a few parallels between that first Christmas with Mary and Joseph and where we are today. I mean, for Mary, there was this sudden crisis, right? When she first learned that she was pregnant, and suddenly there was so much that she had to give up in order to embrace this new reality that had been thrust upon her. We've had tons of things we had to change and give up in our lives, how we work, how we learn, how we worship, how we shop, how we connect to one another. I mean, since this crisis first hit in March, so much of our lives have changed. Then Joseph himself had made some plans based on the information he had available about how he was going now to relate to his fiancée, but an angelic visit caused his plans to change. And we've all been there, haven't we? Maybe not the angelic visit part, but definitely the changing of our plans part, right? So much of what all of us had planned to do in 2020s had to change. In our family, Jody and I had planned to go to England in August to celebrate our 30th anniversary, and we had to cancel that trip. Many of you have also had to put various aspects of your lives on hold. Well, this week we get to see how Mary and Joseph were forced to be together but apart, just like we will be together but apart this Christmas as a church. And I know that online worship isn't the same thing as giving birth in a stable to the Savior of the world, but we might just find a few more similarities between ourselves and the Holy Family than we originally thought. Our passage begins in the 2nd chapter of Luke's Gospel, beginning at verse 1. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and it was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So it all starts with the BMOC, right? The big man on campus, Emperor Augustus, also known as Octavian. In his time, Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor, he was hailed as a divine savior. Some contemporary poets, like Virgil, called him the son of a god. In the ancient city of Halicarnassus, he was hailed as the savior of the whole world. So, yeah, he had a pretty good PR department. Luke tells us that Augustus calls for this worldwide census. Of course, for them, it just meant all within the Roman Empire, of course. Now, in the ancient days, a census was taken for basically one of two reasons: taxation and military prescription. Now, in this case, for the Jewish community in Palestine, it would have simply been for taxation. But Palestine, or the Holy Land, was at that time an occupied territory of Rome. The people within its borders were not free. They hadn't been for years, decades. They did what the Romans told them to do. Most of them were not Roman citizens, so they had very limited rights. But one right they did have was the right to pay taxes. Verse 3. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. So Luke tells us that the Romans wanted all the families to return to the location of their family property for taxation purposes. Now that meant Joseph had to travel from up north in Nazareth down to a little town called Bethlehem, because he had descended from the line of the great King David. Now, although Jerusalem really came to be known as the city of David, Bethlehem was the city in which David was born. It's interesting that Luke doesn't mention the passage from Micah 5, verse 2, which talks about Bethlehem being the place where the future Messiah would come from. Matthew includes that in his birth narratives, but not Luke. But a word of caution. Biblical scholars are pretty uniform in their opinion. How do I put this? There are a number of, shall we say, historical problems with Luke's storytelling. For starters, there is no other report from any historical source outside of the Bible of an empire-wide census at this particular time. There was a census in 6 to 7 CE, which coincided with Quirinius' reign as governor in Syria, but the Jewish historian Josephus treats that census, which did take place in Judea, including Bethlehem, as an event without recent precedent. So why would Luke have added this in? As biblical scholar John Carroll puts it, the census advances the plot by getting Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem for his birth. But the political undercurrent should not be missed. Caesar orders, and the parents of Jesus do what is required. Verse 4 and 5. Joseph also went from the town in Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. Mary was 9 months pregnant at the time. Not exactly the optimal time for a woman in her condition to be traveling. And at this point in the story, though, both Mary and Joseph had made their peace with the current reality of their lives and the situation, and they've embraced it wholeheartedly together. It was about a 90-mile journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Now, to put that into perspective for those of us who live here in Southern California, it's roughly the distance from Palmdale to Disneyland if you go down the 14 and you take the 5 all the way to Anaheim. Oh, walking, that is, right? Just slightly a bit more strenuous than power walking at the local mall. Well, there were 2 routes that Mary and Joseph could have taken to get there. With Nazareth being up north in Galilee and Bethlehem just south of Jerusalem in Judea. The first is what you see here on the screen in red. It's called the Jordan route. It would have taken them east from Nazareth, crossing the Jordan River, then south about 60 miles, and finally recrossing the Jordan near Jericho, and then due west to Bethlehem. This would have been followed by most Jews who wanted to avoid the land of the Samaritans if they were coming from Galilee down to Bethlehem or Jerusalem. And given the Jewish-Samaritan relationship in those days, many, in fact, most people would choose that journey. The second option, though, was a more direct one. It also cut 2 days off of travel time. It took them nearly due south from Nazareth through the Jezreel Valley and along the road known as the Way of the Patriarchs. This route was easier during the first half of the journey, and the second half, though, included some hills and mountains as well as some well-known places to stop for water along the way. Josephus, who I mentioned was a first-century Jewish historian, he noted that during Passover, when large numbers of Jews were making their way from Galilee down to Jerusalem, it wasn't uncommon for Jews to use the second route and actually travel through Samaria. Faithful Jews were willing to go through Samaria during Passover to avoid the other, more crowded passageway. Pastor Adam Hamilton, in his wonderful book on the birth of Jesus called The Journey, comments that we know that Jesus, in his adult ministry, welcomed and included Samaritans. And so he posits, who do you think Jesus learned that welcoming and inclusive attitude from? Well, most likely his parents, of course. And so it was probably unlikely that Mary and Joseph would have traveled 2 days extra out of their way, given the fact that Mary was so far along in her pregnancy, just to avoid a route connecting with Samaritans. No, the chances are high they would have taken the second route, the Way of the Patriarchs. Verse 6 and 7. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, the traditional interpretation of this part of the story goes something like this. Joseph and Mary couldn't find a room to stay in because, being a guy, Joseph figured, who needs to make reservations? We'll just wing it when we get there, right? But let's think about this for a moment, right? If they were all going back to their hometowns, if Joseph's family was from Bethlehem, if he had grown up in Bethlehem, then why would he and Mary need to stay in some Motel 6 somewhere? Right? Wouldn't they have just stayed with his family or distant relatives or at worst, friends? Pastor Adam Hamilton shed some new light on this in the book as I was studying it. The Greek word that's translated as in most versions of Luke's gospel is kataluma. Now, the word has only one other appearance in Luke's gospel, and that's when, or in any of the gospels, and that's when Jesus sends his disciples ahead to find a room for them to share the communion and the Last Supper together. And that room, that kataluma, would have been a guest room in someone's house. Here's a floor plan of a typical first-century house in Palestine. Parents slept in the sleeping quarters, which is on the top right. The main central room served as a kitchen and dining room or common space. And then right in the middle there, you see the ketaluma. That was the third room. That would have been the guest room. Normally, children would have slept there, but when they had visitors and guests over, that's where the guests would stay. And then most homes would have a stable or a small barn. Think of it kind of like a garage for the first century. That was either behind the home or, in case of homes built atop or around caves, which is how many of the houses in Bethlehem were built, it would be beneath a home. Now, the stable protected the animals from predators and thieves at night. Okay, so the guest room might hold bed mats for, let's say, 6 or so people if they're sleeping on the floor side by side. The main living room and kitchen could hold several more. But I wonder how many of Joseph's extended family were there in Bethlehem because of the census. Right? If Joseph had 4 or 5 siblings and each of them had a family, it's easy to see why there would be no room in the Ketaluma. There would be no room left in the guest room. And then there's one other insight from Scripture that supports Pastor Hamilton's research. In Leviticus chapter 12, it says that when a woman gives birth to a son, she is unclean until her child is circumcised on the 8th day in the temple. Now, not only is the mother ritually unclean, but anything she lies on is unclean. Anything she touches is unclean. And if anyone touches her or anything she's touched or sat or lied on, then they also will become unclean. So if Mary had given birth in the Kataluma, in the guest room, she would have rendered everyone else who was staying in that room also unclean. Therefore, it seems likely that Joseph, if he had been staying with his relatives, they would have set up the birthing room in the stable, in the barn, to give Mary and Joseph their privacy and also to keep everyone else from becoming ritually unclean. Think of it as first century social distancing, right? So we can probably put away those notions of a miserly old innkeeper flipping over the no vacancy sign and heartlessly turning away a pregnant woman into the cold night. That's probably not the way the story actually happened. Mary and Joseph were together with their family, but they were separate. Indeed, the very first Christmas for Mary and Joseph would have been quite unexpected, right? In Jesus' day, many women died during childbirth. And in order to prepare for the best, women back then would have made sure that the room where they delivered would have been serene and peaceful. They would have, impending moms would have wanted to be surrounded by their mother and their closest friends and a competent midwife. I mean, that would have been the optimum scenario. But Mary wasn't able to have any of that, right? No birthing room, no OBGYN, no midwife, no heart rate monitors, and definitely no epidural with 2 top-offs. And yet, Christmas, Christ's birth, came nonetheless. Thanks be to God. I'm sure it was a loud, sweaty, bloody, and messy night, that first Christmas. In fact, aren't most births that way? Mary was far from home. She was out of her comfort zone. And remember, she was a teenager. She quite possibly could have been as young as 13 or 14 years old. Nevertheless, she went through it all and came out like a trooper, giving birth to a boy whom they would soon name Jesus because, as the angel told them, he would save the world from their sins. Do you know why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? It's not because we have any proof that Jesus was actually born on the 25th day of December. In fact, biblical scholars really have no clue when it was that Jesus was born. No, we celebrate December 25th because the church over the centuries has come to believe that the birth of the Savior models what's also happening in nature. We're about to come to the winter solstice soon. In fact, it'll be a week from tomorrow night, December 21st. It marks the longest night of the year. Ever since the summer solstice, night has been growing longer and longer, and day has been growing shorter and shorter. And it will continue up until next Monday night, December 21st. But from next Tuesday, things begin to shift. Darkness starts to recede, daylight starts to spread, and the early Christians believed that this is what Jesus was doing in his birth, that light was overcoming the darkness of the world. In fact, the Gospel of John begins with this in mind. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. what has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. You see, Mary and Joseph knew that despite all of the darkness, this baby would change everything. For Jesus is the one who pierces the darkness that is all around us in the world. And man, this year has had more than its share of darkness, hasn't it? None of us signed up for this global pandemic thing. All of our lives will inevitably be altered from this time, from this year on. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way it was, at least not exactly the way it was. So the question is, how will we choose to move forward? Now, we can't come together to worship in person with one another this Christmas. That's true. It is an unexpected Christmas. But we're managing, aren't we, right? For the most part, we've sorted out this online worship scenario thing. I think we're doing okay, all things considering. Yes, we're separate, but we're still together. Not only are we still together, but our numbers have grown in people that have become part of our community during this pandemic. And I've actually been empowered and encouraged by the connection that we've been able to continue to have over the last 8 or so months. Rest assured, at some point we will come back together for in-person worship, but not yet. However, with the vaccine starting to roll out worldwide, I think we're starting to turn the corner. I mean, we still have a long way to go. And I don't know when it is that we'll gather back together for in-person worship. The pandemic is not over by any means. In fact, the infection rates and the death tolls continue to climb at staggering rates. But dawn is breaking. Light is starting to shine. We have to keep our vigilance up. We have to stay safe and protect us and the ones we love. But my sisters and brothers in Christ, may we remember that the Savior of the world was born at a time when the emperor thought he was a god and believed that the world moved and answered to every whim he had. Mary and Joseph moved all right, and they made the trek from Nazareth to Bethlehem, but it wasn't Caesar Augustus who was pulling the strings. No, it was God. And God chose to come into this world in a very humble and simple way, identifying with the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, the powerless, the homeless. And if God can do that then, in first century Palestine, just imagine what God can do now during this time of COVID-19 and the global pandemic. This truly will be an unexpected Christmas, friends. You can count on that. But may our hearts be open to the light that is starting to shine and break through. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Amen.